Stephen could smell the faint scent of alcohol coming from the security room. Silver Shield Corporation had finances and superior technology on their side, but it seemed like their management wasn't worth bragging about. The Leviathan unit members had done a thorough inspection of the laboratory. The computers contained records of experiments with biochemical drugs. They made a copy of this information, including the formulas of the drugs. They also discovered that a large portion of the factory's profits were transferred to the royal family's upper management. If it weren't for the continuous investment of foreign capital, Cadis would have long been ruined by internal issues. The two Leviathan unit members were skilled professionals. Before they left the lab to meet up with Stephen, they erased traces of their fingerprints and footprints. "We've made a copy of their hard drive." "Well done. Let's blow this place up and meet up with the others." Stephen used his inner energy to position the 7 gems below the containers and climbed out the window with his team. They scaled the outer wall and ran as far as they could. The containers were huge, and there were too many of them. None of them knew how big the explosion would be. The 3 of them crossed the beach and sneaked onto the shore. They headed deeper into the city just to be safe. The reinforced concrete buildings would be more than enough to withstand the impact of the shockwave. The gems spun violently and tore through the containers in the factory. Sparks flew from the collision. Stephen and his team watched the factory explode into smithereens. Smoke billowed into the sky, and a cloud of mist as high temperature vaporized the seawater. The beach went up in flames, and the pungent smell of chemicals filled the air. The explosion was much stronger than what a cannon or tank could accomplish. The entire beach was reduced to ashes. If the factory was left alone, the contamination would have spread to the ocean and affected the food chain. The civilians who were none the wiser would be negatively affected. Cadis's authorities rushed to the beach. The civilians locked their doors in fear and stayed back in their homes. A black off-road vehicle stopped in front of Stephen. It was the Leviathan unit's intelligence team stationed in Cadis. "Please follow us, Mr. Adams. The whole city will be under martial law soon." Stephen and his team climbed into the vehicle, and it sped off into the night. The Leviathan unit's base was located in a small village by the side of the mountain around 40 miles from the city. They'd purchased a random house in the village and went around as ordinary villagers. Stephen took a seat on the sofa and turned on the TV. Reporters from the local television stations had gathered near the beach to deliver breaking news to the public. The cameras were shaky, and their voices were muffled. The government was forced to hold a press conference and make an official statement. They were allies with Silver Shield Corporation, but someone had to take the blame. And that someone couldn't be the government. If the public's anger was directed at them, their influence over the country would be weakened. Based on the preliminary investigation, the accident occurred at Silver Shield Corporation's factory. The chemicals in the storage room were highly flammable, and a spark could have triggered an explosion. We're in contact with the company's senior management. Please don't be alarmed, and wait for a more detailed explanation. The Leviathan unit guessed that the 3 bosses behind Silver Shield Corporation had fled the moment they heard the explosion. "When should we release the evidence we found to the public? The people will vent their anger on Cadis's government." Stephen didn't think there was much the civilians could do. It would be better to use this information to request for compensation. The contamination in the water and the mutated sea creatures had affected trade at the eastern port. This was their opportunity to squeeze Cadis dry of their money. "Request the legal division to make a loss evaluation. I'll pressure the royal family through a round of negotiations." In a quaint and unadorned palace, the king of Cadis, Javon Lorenz, exploded with anger. The 2 princes and the ministers shrank back in fear, not knowing which unlucky person would be forced to take responsibility for the explosion. The king paced around the hall. Silver Shield Corporation's been exaggerating their technology to no end, but now an accident has occurred at their factory. This can't be overlooked. No matter how deep their background is or how extensive their connections are, our priority is to capture their upper management. The Prime Minister in charge of security came forward nervously. "The upper management has always been elusive. There's no trace of them." "What are you trying to say? Did they vanish from the face of the earth?" "Perhaps they left the country before the accident." Javon gripped his cane, resisting the urge to beat the idiot in front of him to death. If the Prime Minister was incapable of catching people in their own country, then what was he capable of? freeze their assets, and request assistance from international organizations. Yes, sir, the Prime Minister answered in a shaky voice. Sorvis, Juno, and Mike had indeed escaped. They kept a private jet near Cadis's metropolis and a cruise ship on the open sea as a precaution. They were filled with anger. The manpower and resources they had spent had gone down the drain. The three of them leaned against the railing on the deck, waiting for the cool sea breeze to calm their fury. We couldn't find any issues when we inspected the factory. That explosion happened a few hours later. It couldn't have been an accident. Who would dare trespass on our property? It's hard to say. The tallest tree attracts the wind. Silver Shield Corporation is a successful business. There are many people out there who want to take us down. The explosion had messed up their plans. Rather than staying in Cadis and targeting the Sovereign, they had to come up with a way to protect their subsidiary company's assets. Maybe their neighboring countries could help them. They were old friends with Warhawk, so they decided to seek refuge there first. After several hours of tension-filled waiting at Cadis's palace, the king finally received a report from his subordinates. The person in charge of the factory acknowledged the presence of highly flammable and dangerous liquids stored in the factory, but he was clueless as to what set off the explosion. The two princes voiced their opinions. We should slow down the investigation to prevent affecting the infrastructure projects that Silver Shield Corporation's investing in. Their investment isn't a one-time transaction. The amount is recalculated every quarter. If they completely give up on our country, the projects will be left unfinished. The ministers were in agreement. They'd received bribes from Silver Shield Corporation over the years, and they couldn't cut ties with them so easily. Javon once again threw a difficult question at the Prime Minister. How are we going to explain this to the people? The explosion destroyed the entire beach. The civilians are afraid. If we don't handle this properly, our government will lose credibility. The smoke from the explosion is affecting tourism in the city. I suggest using the assets we've frozen from Silver Shield Corporation to compensate the affected establishments. As for the rest, we can decide that later after more investigation. The Prime Minister's plan was to delay the outcome as much as possible, and the king had no choice but to go along with it. Silver Shield Corporation was a major source of capital in Cadis. The country couldn't afford to lose them. 3 days later, a delegation team from the U.S. arrived in Cadis. 20 high-standard warships sailed to the coastal port, and an aerial squadron circled the skies above the sea. This was essentially stationing armed forces in front of the neighboring house to intimidate them. The King of Cadis led his team of ministers to welcome them. Mr. Adams, your visit is a bit sudden, and you've brought extraordinary transportation facilities with you. Our countries have always been on friendly terms. We can't risk any accidents. Stephen flashed a knowing smile. He could already sense the guilt in Javon's voice. Aren't you aware of what happened on the beach? I've brought armed forces with me as a precaution. The government had failed in preventing the scandal from spreading, and Javon had nothing to say in defense. He took Stephen's delegation team to the palace. A welcoming banquet had been arranged. Stephen wasn't interested in the delicacies on the table. He motioned for the delegation team to submit the compensation agreement. The contamination from Silver Shield Corporation's factory had not only affected Cadis, but also the U.S. Javon's jaw dropped when the gaze fell on the long string of numbers on the claim. There was a list of densely packed details outlining the damages. The total amount was as high as 177 billion USD. Mr. Adams, this amount is inappropriate, don't you think? Are you using the explosion as an excuse to empty our country's national treasury? The numbers you see on the page do not only refer to the damages from the explosion. Due to your inadequate management, a significant amount of chemical pollution from the factories entered our waters, and it has caused serious consequences. Directly accusing our country's internal management model is overstepping your authority. The factory's undergone inspection and has been approved for production. Don't put all the blame on us. In front of Stephen and his delegation team, the secrets in Javon's heart were as clear as a mirror, but he stubbornly defended his stance. The ministers sitting next to him nodded in agreement. Stephen's subordinates plugged in a flash drive to a laptop connected to a projector on the wall. Evidence of biochemical drugs, mutated marine life, and bank transfer records were on full display. After a long silence, Javon spoke. The documents you've provided will be valuable for reference. However, I'll need my team to verify its credibility. We can't rely on a few pictures to validate the truth. The tactical method of delaying the inevitable was being used once again. Stephen understood that Cadis didn't have the means to pay such a large compensation. But they could compensate in other ways, like land, coal, petroleum, natural gases, precious metal ores, and other resources. You can take your time with your investigation. To ensure the safety of the ocean, our warships and air forces will monitor your progress all day long. With a few buttons, your metropolis will be turned to dust. The ministers did their best to suppress their panic and began criticizing Stephen for threatening his neighboring countries with force. If war broke out, Cadis would seek help from across the world to defend its honor. Stephen responded to the threat with a warning of his own. If you keep this up, we'll be forced to contact our allies and have them station their armed forces in your waters. If we can win a battle against multiple countries on our own, and it's a given that we'll win every subsequent battle. If you're not convinced, you're welcome to try us. Memories of the conflict at the northern border came to everyone's mind. The sovereign wasn't exaggerating. He was merely stating facts. Tension filled the air. If negotiations continued like this, both countries would end up on bad terms. The two princes stepped forward. Mr. Adams, we understand how you feel. Securing the ocean's safety is important, but isn't bringing your armed forces into this a bit much? We must be prepared for every outcome. If another similar factory were to come into existence, we'd destroy it without prior notice to eliminate pollution. Don't be surprised when the time comes. Every one of Stephen's sentences showed off the United States' military, but behind every word was a justifiable reason. Javon had no choice but to change the topic. After the meal, they would continue their discussion at the negotiation table. Farola and his team were in the study, enjoying a glass of wine as they examined the evidence laid out on the table. Those two are obsessed with money. They accept every bribe they come across, no matter which company it's from. The head of the Hearst family nodded in agreement at the side of the table. They're young, but they're cunning. They use gold bars to erase evidence of their crimes. They don't keep the gold they receive for too long. It's melted and forged into jewelry, which is then sold at another store. Their dirty money is washed clean. As a cardinal who lived in the middle of nowhere in the snowy plains, Farola didn't know much about these things. He found it fascinating. How will the sovereign react to evidence of their bribes? Will he execute them in the name of justice? I don't think so, the head of the family said. According to the law, accepting and forcing bribes will land them in jail for around 10 years. It's not that serious of a crime. All right. We'll act according to the plan. Farola and his team disguised themselves as bodyguards and followed the head of the Hearst family to Annapolis. If they wanted to get rid of the sovereign, they would have to choose a location to gain a firm foothold, and the ideal place was at the eastern port. Now that they'd secured their backer, they could move forward on the next step of their plan. An assassination attempt on the sovereign's life would be risky, and the success rate wasn't that high. Using a more conservative method was much safer. Farola reviewed the news article about Silver Shield Corporation and knew right away that their days in the U.S. had come to an end. Let's overturn the hierarchy at the eastern port. We're here on a mission, but we can't waste our trip. We'll taste the delicious food and fill our pockets at the same time. The wealthy families and maritime companies at the eastern port had gotten rid of the jackals only to welcome the tigers and leopards. They didn't know if they'd ever be able to return to their peaceful lives. When Stephen returned to Annapolis, he called his subordinate into his office. The outcome of his negotiations with Cadis were still unclear. Maybe Javon would fight to the end and refuse to pay off the $177 billion compensation. Aside from Cadis, there were other pressing matters at hand. Those who were itching to get their hands on the sacred manual were likely making their move behind the scenes. Maybe they'd already infiltrated the country. They had to resolve these issues carefully to prevent internal and external disasters from erupting at the same time. The Leviathan unit hasn't made much progress. How is the world reacting to our recent broadcast? Stephen asked. We've conducted an investigation on those who left and entered the country recently, his subordinate said. But there wasn't anyone noteworthy except for a few major internationally wanted criminals. Our official database has been hacked over 50 million times. Using reverse tracking, we've found that their servers are located overseas. We've also found traces of martial artists at the borders, but we haven't tracked them down. It wasn't easy for ordinary people to survive harsh environments, but it was a different story when martial artists were involved. Stephen wasn't too worried. There were many people interested in the sacred manual, but their curiosity hadn't reached the point where the country was at risk of being thrown into turmoil. The situation with Cadis is getting more complicated. Work together and exert pressure until they compromise. Don't forget to pay attention to our neighboring countries, especially Warhawk. The administration building of the government's security department was located at the center of Annapolis. Today, the streets in front of the building were unusually quiet. There were no pedestrians in sight, and officers on patrol were everywhere. A black pickup truck stopped in the middle of the street with several high-powered stereos in the rear compartment. Before the officers could stop them or inspect their truck, a deafening voice blasted from the speakers. Please hear me out. We commoners struggle to put food on our table every day. We rely on our small businesses to make a living, but these criminals have been shutting us down. We had no choice but to come all the way to Annapolis to request your assistance. The loud voice attracted the entire neighborhood's attention. Pedestrians crowded the streets and took out their phones to record and snap pictures. Some even started a live broadcast. Stephen was having a meeting with the directors of the security department, and they heard the commotion loud and clear from the office. What's happening? Stephen demanded. The head of the department prayed he wouldn't be implicated. Why did this have to happen today of all days, when the sovereign was here? A civilian is protesting in front of the building. He says he came to seek justice. I'll ask my people to question him and find out what's going on. The head of the Hearst family and his two fake subordinates went through numerous body searches before they were allowed to see the sovereign. The head of the family had rehearsed this scene multiple times in his head on the way here. He wasn't nervous, even though he was in the same room as the sovereign. Why were you shouting on the streets? Stephen asked. What is the grievance you speak of? The head of the Hearst family reached into his pocket and pulled out the photos he'd prepared. He handed them over and explained how his business at the Eastern Port had been exploited and oppressed. Not only had his business been taken away, he had also had to give up a portion of his profits as tribute. The security department staff, who were standing next to Stephen, were about to refute until the man named the people in the photo as Harry Cassidy and Rebecca Cassidy. The two of them were the sovereign's in-laws, and they were related to his wife. It would be better to let Stephen make the decision himself. The photo was quite clear, and there was no mistaking what was happening. Harry and Rebecca had bright smiles on their faces as they received heavy gold bars from their competitors. Official funds used for transactions would usually be deposited into their company's accounts. Even if it was a present from family and friends, it was unusual to give gold bars as gifts. All signs pointed to a suspicious transaction. We'll open an investigation at the Eastern Port immediately. Please follow the staff to make an official statement as part of the procedure. Stephen's tone was neutral, but he was seething on the inside. Harry and Rebecca were never easy to deal with. This time, they'd gotten themselves into trouble and were dragging Kim down with them. It was only a few days ago that she attended the Maritime Trade Association's ceremony to cut the ribbon, which was the same as acknowledging their business. If it was proven that Harry and Rebecca had committed a crime, Kim's reputation would be tarnished. The head of the Hearst family leaned in and lowered his voice. Harry and Rebecca charge service and consultation fees to the companies at the port. They claim they're allowed to do so because they have a strong backer. I've been hesitating to speak up because I'm worried they'll take revenge on me if the issue isn't resolved properly. Harry and Rebecca's biggest backer was obviously referring to the sovereign. The staff took the head of the Hearst family to another room to record his statement. Stephen instructed the directors to form a team and head to the Eastern Port to investigate. The country was upheld by laws, and speculations were pointless. The truth would come to light after evidence was obtained. Negative rumors circulated on the internet. Before Farola came to Annapolis, he'd spent a large sum of money to hire people to expose the shady business at the Eastern Port. This case involved two impressive big shots, and the mainstream media outlets lost their voices. They didn't have the courage to interview the sovereign or Kim. Stephen swallowed his anger and went home with a smile on his face. Kim was curled up on the couch in the living room, feeling wronged. Those two can't run a business legally to save their lives. Stephen sat next to her and stroked her hair. Don't blame yourself. It's not your fault. This wouldn't have happened if he had been stricter with them, even though they were Kim's family. I heard Cerulean Shipping Company had been receiving a large amount of foreign capital, but it stopped coming in recently, Kim said. Their profits aren't worth mentioning. When we stop Cadis from suppressing our overseas trade, our international market will expand and develop. It makes no difference whether Cerulean Shipping Company is around or not. Also, Silver Shield Corporation's landed themselves in hot water. They won't be investing in the U.S. anytime soon. Harry and Rebecca felt like they'd been struck by lightning when they read the rumors on the internet. To make matters worse, an armed government official broke into their office, demanding for them to come with him and cooperate with the investigation. The entire region was under martial law. All means of transportation were also under strict control. It was impossible for them to escape. Harry's knees went weak, and he collapsed in his chair. This has to be a misunderstanding. Someone set me up because they're envious of our profits. Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes. She didn't have the energy to argue. She knew exactly what she and Harry had done. I want to call my lawyer, Harry protested. Go ahead, the officer said. Our investigation will be conducted according to proper procedures. After an investigation, the Maritime Trade Association officially closed its doors. The Cerulean Shipping Company's office building underwent a drastic change. The officer in charge of customs took over the orders with the other companies at the port to prevent disrupting the lives of regular employees. During the investigation, over 100 kilograms of gold bars were found, including antiques, calligraphy, painting, and unregistered bonds from foreign banks. The goods would be handed over to the local police department to handle. They might be able to find out which big shots were involved by extracting the fingerprints. When Harry and Rebecca were taken away, the investigation team suspected that there was an illegal business contract in place involving Silver Shield Corporation's factory project in the Northern Industrial Zone. Tina and Cade laid low, ignored the heavy losses, and waited for an opportunity to leave the country. Several days later, the head of the Cassidy family, DeAndre, and his nephew, Ron, arrived at Kim and Stephen's villa in a luxury car. It wasn't easy for them to enter the house. The guard went inside to report their arrival, leaving them standing at the gates. Kim and Stephen were planning to have the evening to themselves, but their mood was ruined when the guard knocked on the door. They're here to plead for Harry and Rebecca, the guard said. Should I send them away? Stephen glanced at Kim. She didn't say anything, but she had a complicated look on her face. The Cassidy family didn't treat her well, but DeAndre was an exception. He decided to let them in for a chat. DeAndre and Ron were overwhelmed with relief as they walked into the living room. They were mesmerized by the extravagance of the interior. The tiles beneath their feet were inlaid with crystals. Toys designed by world-class artists were haphazardly placed on chairs, couches, and furniture. Just as they were about to give Stephen a lengthy greeting, he cut them off. If you have something to say, then sit down and say it. I don't have a lot of time. Despite everything, DeAndre and Ron were Kim's family, and Steve had treated them with basic etiquette. The two of them nervously took a seat on the couch across from Stephen. They were racked with nerves. Two useless members of their family had caused a storm in the city, and they had to clean up their mess. DeAndre was the first to speak. Harry and Rebecca's unlawful actions have caused serious losses to maritime trade at the Eastern Port. We'd like to use our family's resources to compensate for the damages as much as possible. Harry and Rebecca were manipulative and cunning, but they were timid and meek in the face of authorities. It didn't take them long to crack from the pressure and reveal everything they were guilty of during the interrogation. DeAndre and Ron were hoping to lighten the sentence before the verdict was passed. How are you two planning to make up for it? Stephen asked. When the investigation department finishes calculating the total losses, we'll be more than willing to compensate the full amount. For a second, Stephen didn't know what to say. Were they naive or just stupid? Maybe they were hoping he wouldn't take this too seriously. The so-called losses aren't limited to service and consultation fees they forced their competitors to pay. The business they stole from the other companies should also be taken into consideration. According to customs statistics, there are an average of 10 shipping companies at the port, and the cost of each round of transportation is around $15 million. However, Harry and Rebecca forced the ships to make 2 extra rounds, which is an extra $30 million in losses. This is just an average. There are many shipping companies at the port. If you would like to compensate, please prepare at least $600 million. We'll calculate the subsequent fines separately. We're not in a hurry. Take your time. DeAndre and Ron were dumbfounded by the exorbitant sum. They wouldn't have enough even if they sold everything they have. There were many industries that appeared successful on the surface, but didn't have much capital in private. The numbers Stephen listed had been calculated using real estate, raw materials, and stockpiled goods. More importantly, the fines hadn't been factored in yet. It could raise the final compensation by 3 or 5 times, and when that happened, even $2 billion might not be enough. That amount exceeds our finances, DeAndre said. Could we reduce the compensation or draw up a plan to pay in installments? Stephen didn't care about their compensation. Once they completed negotiations with Cadis, they would receive hundreds of billions of extra income. That would be more than enough to rebuild the Eastern Port. Are you haggling with the laws and regulations? You have no respect for our country. As the saying goes, if the higher one isn't upright, the lower one is crooked. Given Harry and Rebecca's personalities, maybe their family upbringing is the problem. DeAndre and Ron turned to Kim, their last resort. We understand that what Harry and Rebecca did was wrong, but our family needs someone to take over the business. If it's not them, then can you do it for us, Kim? We'll have authority over the distribution of profits. Kim didn't want to interfere with Stephen's work, nor did she want to get involved with the Cassidy family again. She turned DeAndre's offer down. The investigation isn't over yet, Stephen continued. The Fallon family's properties are also being investigated. If I remember correctly, Harry and Rebecca are in charge of more than one company. They can't avoid responsibility. It's getting late. Head back and wait for the investigation results. Their discussion went nowhere. Not only had DeAndre and Ron failed to accomplish their objectives, they were given more reasons to be afraid of the future. Their identity as elders was useless. Harry and Rebecca's crimes were set in stone. To think we left seclusion a few years ago to just be wrapped up in this mess, Ron said, getting in the back seat of the car. Mr. Adams doesn't want us to get involved. We can't go against him. Ron was already thinking about giving up on Harry and Rebecca. If they pressed the issue, the mess would only get bigger. DeAndre let out a long sigh. As the head of the family, I can't watch our businesses fail. Capital flows continuously. There's no pause button. We have to think about our employees' salaries, property rent, and contracts. If money isn't coming in, we'll be left with more losses than gains. Unfortunately, the investigation didn't progress as fast as DeAndre and Ron had hoped. The staff needed time to follow the clues and dig up the co-conspirators. Stephen had free time on his hands while investigating what was going on. He went to the training grounds on the outskirts of Annapolis. It had been a long time since he heard from Tristan and Zane. He had no idea what the 2 ancient men with deceptively youthful appearances were up to. Jace welcomed him at the entrance. He looked tired compared to the last time they met, and his aura had undergone subtle changes. What happened to you? Stephen asked. You look like you've been through the ringer. Did you cultivate the ancient martial arts factions when they were here? No, I didn't have time for that. I've been looking after Tristan and Zane with the Leviathan unit. They have a tendency to point out issues with our cultivation and make suggestions on how to improve. They also like to test their theories on us. We've progressed without realizing it. Stephen recalled the hardcore training Tristan had given him and Salim in the underground palace. He patted Jace's shoulder with a sympathetic look. It's been hard on you. At least they're finally assuming their role as martial arts instructors. In the underground gravity room, Tristan and Zane had increased the value to 100 times the norm. Anyone who went into the room would feel the pressure of a mountain beating down on them. Stephen and Jace stepped inside and watched Tristan and Zane moving around like nothing had changed. They were impressed with their martial arts. Zane came over to say hello. You're really hard to find when you get busy. I haven't seen your face since the first day I came here. As a top martial artist, you should prioritize your cultivation instead of worldly affairs. With a strong fist, all your problems will be resolved easily. Stephen nodded and said nothing. He guessed this was the general mindset of ancient martial artists. They resolved everything with force. Tristan came over with a suggestion of his own. Why is this room limited to 100 times the normal gravity? We can't go all out. We live on Earth, and the laws of physics are limited, Stephen said matter-of-factly. What do you want me to do about it? How about this? If there's an opportunity, I'll purchase a rocket and send you to a neutron star in outer space. You can play all you want in zero gravity. What do you think? Tristan pursed his lips and kept quiet, not entertained by the thought of going to outer space. The four of them went up to the lounge on the first floor. The staff served them cold beverages and desserts as a group of researchers from the Research Institute in Annapolis reported their observational findings on Zane's body. Stephen didn't understand the technical aspects. He asked Zane for his perspective. Your body is the first of its kind. It's natural for it to have defects. What's your opinion? It has its limits. When my inner energy fluctuates, it tears my insides, and the healing is delayed. I have to pay attention to that when I'm fighting. Zane was an elite martial artist from ancient times. The strength he possessed was unimaginable. Even if his spiritual will was the only part of him that survived, a body created from biochemical technology wouldn't be able to withstand his cultivation. Is there anything you can do to improve his body? Stephen asked the researchers. This is the best we can do for now. We'll have to wait for a future breakthrough. The staff left after giving their assessment, but Zane wasn't that disappointed. After thousands of years, his mentality had changed a long time ago. He didn't care about ascending past the limits of humanity anymore. He was more interested in resolving his grudges. I heard you have a good relationship with the ancient martial arts factions. Let's organize an event. What event? Stephen asked, confused. A martial arts competition. The prize will be a fragment of the sacred manual. Stephen gave Zane an incredulous look. The sacred manual existed in legends, and it was the same manual that fueled his false propaganda. Where was this coming from? I wouldn't say that we're close, but it's not impossible for me to call them over. Isn't the sacred manual valuable? Why would you offer it up as a prize? I'm not interested in the sacred manual or the competition, Zane said. I'm not going to participate either. I just want to find my enemies as descendants. If I analyze the participants' martial arts techniques during the competition, I'll know where they come from. Mr. Zane, why are you so persistent? You have a physical body now. This is your new lease on life. Zane's eyes narrowed. If someone killed you and your wife, you wouldn't say that so lightly. Stephen threw up his hands in surrender. Point taken. The ancient martial arts factions lived in secluded and unusual places. It would be hard for him to gather them in a short time period. He decided to leave this task to the Leviathan unit and choose somewhere suitable to build an arena instead. If the sacred manual was announced as the prize, the Tribulation sect would do everything in their power to get their hands on it. The time and effort it would take to hold a competition would be worth it if this gave them an opportunity to wipe out the Tribulation sect. When Tristan was in his thief era, he only cared about the quantity of treasures he stole, not the quality. One day, when he and Zane had nothing better to do at the training grounds, they searched the tower for interesting treasures to pass the time. That was when they realized that Tristan had a fragment of the sacred manual in his possession. Stephen couldn't pass up the opportunity for a glimpse at the legendary sacred manual. Can you let me read it? I've been releasing fake news for a while now, but I've never seen the real thing in person. Sure, but don't be too disappointed. Tristan took out a metal plate and placed it upside down on the table. Inscriptions of strange symbols and diagrams were engraved on the back. The plate wasn't as thin as a talisman, but they were similar. Stephen reached for the plate. Why didn't you turn it over? To protect the world from the content, Tristan said with a shrug. Stephen flipped the plate over, and a blinding light seared his eyes. His mind went blank like he was looking directly into the sun. He was in a trance for half a minute until Tristan snatched the plate from his hands and put it back on the table upside down. Stephen rubbed his eyes. Damn, what the hell was that? Is this a weapon? He lifted the plate without turning it around and ran his fingers over the surface underneath. He felt the curvature of the uneven bumps, which meant that there were more engravings on the front. Zane shook his head. Your cultivation is too low. You need to progress if you want to see the words clearly. Feeling the indentation of the bumps of the engravings wouldn't do anything. The power of natural laws couldn't be passed down through words or art. It had to be understood, and the amount of content one could understand depended on luck. Stephen returned the plate to Tristan. It doesn't matter if I can't read it. This will be good bait. The entire world will be interested. But there's one problem. Mr. Zane, are you confident you can keep the situation under control? There's going to be a lot of people coming after this plate. Zane gestured to Tristan. Did you forget about him? He's my helper. With the two of us around, what's there to worry about? The two of them had come to a secret agreement. When this was over, Zane would let Tristan select a few of his treasures to add to his collection. With Zane and Tristan volunteering their assistance, the matter was settled. First, Stephen would have to choose the location to build the arena. He went to the Leviathan Unit's headquarters to consult Salim. The competition would attract martial artists from around the world. It wouldn't be easy to keep them in check. They had to choose a secluded area to prevent ordinary people from being affected. Constructing an arena deep in the mountains and forests would cost too much manpower, material resources, and time. It wouldn't be worth it. Salim had an idea. Mirage Island is surrounded by water with a relatively complete infrastructure. It'll be a good venue for the competition. If Tristan and Zane decide to start a massacre, no one will be able to run. But Dr. Dalton's team has unfinished projects on the island, Stephen said. There's also confidential information and advanced equipment to think about. The Research Institute on the island had taken an enormous sum of money to construct. Having the island destroyed because of a competition wouldn't be worth it. Salim returned to his office and came back with Harry and Rebecca's latest statements. As the investigation continued, more of their crimes were brought to light. Pressuring their competitors and imposing fees were just the tip of the iceberg. Harry and Rebecca had a deep relationship with Silver Shield Corporation. They leaked the route and time of military transport ships, which meant that they were involved in the initial attack with the mutated octopus. With every revelation, Stephen inched closer to dealing with Harry and Rebecca himself. But he held back for Kim. Before the investigation was completed, Mirage Island was dangerous, and it wouldn't be safe for Dr. Dalton's team to return anytime soon. They might as well move the incomplete research to a different location and use the island as a battlefield. The prisoners with the AI chip are loyal and skilled martial artists, Salim said. They're used to patrolling the island, so there won't be too many problems. In the end, Stephen was convinced. The construction team would head to Mirage Island and begin building the arena. Tina and Cade were staying in the industrial zone to the north of the eastern port. Construction of the factory was halfway finished with an investment of hundreds of millions. They couldn't proceed until they received further instructions from the three big bosses behind Silver Shield Corporation because of the huge sum of money on the line. But their superiors had gone off the radar, and the only thing they could do was wait and hope for them to reach out. When the investigation team obtained sufficient evidence to convict Tina and Cade, Jace was put in charge of the arrest. It just so happened that it was after work hours, and Stephen was idling at home with nothing to do. He decided to tag along to relieve his boredom. The northern industrial zone was filled with vehicles. Most of them were heavy trucks. The close proximity to the eastern port and in-depth processing of the industrial park made the import and export trade a prosperous industry. Tina and Cade finished their inspections for the day and returned to the five-star hotel next to the construction site. The Leviathan Unit's intelligence team had already used their authority to take over the hotel. Stephen observed the situation through a tablet that connected to every security camera in the building. A waiter was pushing a dining cart to Tina and Cade's VIP suite. They ordered red wine, roasted duck, steak, lobster, caviar, and a variety of desserts. Those two have a big appetite, but this is going to be their last extravagant meal for a long time. This is where the trail ends, Jace said. The owners of Silver Shield Corporation stopped contacting them after what happened in Cadus. There's no more leads to go on. Jace was disappointed, because even if they caught Tina and Cade, the real problem would still be left unresolved. Steven didn't care. For a multinational company like Silver Shield Corporation, it was a given that their bosses were more cunning than usual. At the first sign of trouble, they ran and found a corner to hide in. Making a fortune in silence was what they were best at. In the VIP suite, Tina and Cade drank to their heart's content, oblivious to the predicament awaiting them. "Our superiors are more cowardly than I thought," Tina said with a laugh. "They ran away because of Cadis's royal family." Cade grinned. "The further they run, the better. We don't need them to tell us what to do. All we need is their funding. I fabricated commercial contracts using Cerulean Shipping Company's name and deposited the money into our private accounts. Harry and Rebecca have been arrested, and we don't know what'll happen to them. We can't follow in their footsteps." "Good work," Tina praised. They didn't mind that the company was in trouble. They weren't that loyal to begin with. If constructing a factory in the U.S. didn't work out, they could leave whenever they wanted and find a small country to enjoy the rest of their lives. "Our bodyguards might be spying on us for our superiors," Tina warned. "Mind your words when they're around." Cade picked up his glass and downed the wine. "It'll be fine. I arrange meals, drinks, and entertainment for them every day. It's like they're taking a paid vacation. No one will know when we run away. Things can't get any better than this." While they were dreaming about the wonderful lives in the future, Steve and Jace and a small group of Leviathan unit members arrived in a corridor outside the VIP suite. They heard laughter from inside the room. Steven motioned to two of the Leviathan unit members. "You two, come with me. We'll handle Tina and Cade. Everyone else, follow Jace and deal with the bodyguards next door. It's almost midnight. Don't make too much noise. There are investors staying at the hotel. We should try not to bother them." Jace was confident. Even at such a close distance, he could barely sense the bodyguards' auras. They were more like normal people than martial artists. "We'll take care of them within 10 minutes. One of the Leviathan unit members changed into a waiter's uniform and pushed a dining cart to the room. He knocked on the door, announcing that he was here to pick up empty plates and deliver fruits. Cade chuckled as he opened the door. "The food was great. You can count on me to give you a 5-star rating." When the Leviathan unit member pushed the cart inside, he lifted the cover of the tray. There was a flash bomb in place of fruits. A flash of light filled the room, blinding Tina and Cade. They felt like thousands of needles were piercing their eyes. Tina and Cade squeezed their eyes shut as they pulled out their daggers. They weren't that skilled, but they did know some martial arts. They pricked their ears, sensing movement in the room. When the Leviathan unit members approached, Tina and Cade infused their weapons with their inner energy and attacked in random directions. The VIP suite was bigger than most of the other rooms, but space was still limited. Their slashes released waves of energy that spanned the room. The Leviathan unit members darted behind the furniture to dodge. Steven was watching the fight in the corridor. He lost his patience when Tina and Cade started swinging their daggers randomly. He materialized his gems, and they flew into the room. The gems struck Tina and Cade in their shoulders and abdomen. Their faces contorted, and they collapsed, groaning in pain. Their bodyguards in the other room heard the commotion and jumped out of their seats to check on them. They opened the door, only for Jace to kick them back inside. "Who are you trying to save when you can't even protect yourselves? We are under official orders to arrest you and your employers." These bodyguards were skilled martial artists whom Zorvis, Juno, and Mike had carefully selected from overseas. They didn't care about anything except being paid on time. Breaking the law in a foreign country was nothing to them. The moment Jace finished talking, the bodyguards lunged for him and the Leviathan unit members. The bodyguards were used to resolving conflicts with their fists during previous missions, but this time, their aggression was met with even more aggression. In less than 5 minutes, the bodyguards were sprawled on the floor. They finally realized the gravity of the situation when Jace shoved an arrest warrant in their faces, and the Leviathan unit pulled out handcuffs. These law enforcement officers weren't playing around. Just as they were about to yell and beg for Tina and Cade to use their connections to get them out of this, they spotted their superiors being carried away on stretchers in the corridor. It was obvious that Tina and Cade's injuries were more serious than theirs. Stephen smothered the creases on his button-down shirt with a frown, like he was unsatisfied. Take all of them to the police station and interrogate them. Tonight's operation concluded without a hitch. None of the guests noticed the disturbance. Silver Shield Corporation's factory was suspended indefinitely. The funds in their account were frozen, and their employees were taken into custody for investigation. After many rounds of arduous negotiations, Cadis's royal family gave in. Importing and exporting goods was impossible with the waterways blocked. It wouldn't help even if Warhawk or the island state arranged for air transportation. The only other path out of the country was a high-speed railway connecting Cadis to the rest of the world, but the U.S. temporarily increased the entry and exit fees by 15 times. Their excuse was that they were raising funds for the environment. During the final round of negotiations, the $177 billion compensation decreased to $150 billion. With that, the contract was signed. Stephen reviewed the scanned version of the contract on his computer in his office. Cadis bragged about their friendship with Warhawk and the island state, but in the end, they didn't get a single cent from them. Cadis only had enough to pay off $30 billion of the agreed compensation. The rest would be paid in installments. Their mines and fields became collateral, and they would be handled by the U.S. In the evening, Stephen went home and discussed a new business opportunity with Kim. Ores in Cadis need to be mined and transported by the government to the heavy industry base in the Northeast. All you need to do is arrange for people to take over the fields. You can build theme parks, factories, residential areas, or whatever you want. Kim wasn't following. Cadis wouldn't be interested in projects without commercial profit. Why would they agree to a losing business? The money isn't for Cadis, Stephen explained. It'll be used to support the shipping companies at the eastern port. There are many mountains and rivers in Cadis, but not that many plains are suitable for farming. The U.S. is selling grains at a low price, which discourages farmers in Cadis, forcing them to change their occupation. It won't be long before their food industry starts to rely on foreign imports. Kim understood Stephen's plan. This would help the U.S. monopolize the commercial food market in Cadis. Across the ocean, the three bosses behind Silver Shield Corporation were currently on vacation at a beach in Warhawk. The warm and humid climate, the dazzling sunlight, and the seductive women in bikinis should have made this a relaxing trip, but they were too concerned over recent events to enjoy their vacation. Juno set his wine glass on the table. Tina and Cade were arrested in the U.S. We can't count on them to leave our names out of their confession. Zorvis browsed the news on his laptop. It's not as bad as you think. The authorities in the U.S. and Cadis haven't issued arrest warrants for us. Let the middle management clean up Silver Shield Corporation's mess. They can't close the case until they catch us. The three of them owned multiple research institutes, but their researchers had reached a bottleneck and required external support to achieve a breakthrough in their research. This was the difference between private capital and national capital. Strengthening the body and achieving eternal life was a dream shared among the upper class. They couldn't give up on the U.S. Zorvis thought about having a discussion with the sovereign. There was still hope as long as money was involved, and they could send a lawyer to represent them to keep their identities hidden. We'll offer $5 billion to purchase their biochemical technology or ask for information about the ancient text. If he makes this easy for us, we could give him a few multinational corporations too. Juno and Mike were skeptical. Do you really think that's going to work? Don't treat the sovereign like a beggar. Why would he be in need of money? They complained, but they didn't have any better ideas. After some discussion, they agreed to Zorvis's plan. Sending a professional lawyer to the U.S. to represent them was as easy as lifting a finger. Moreover, the three of them weren't on bad terms with the U.S., so they wouldn't be targeted. The next morning, the famous lawyer, Lester, left with his entourage. His assistants were worried. The United States' legal system is different from Warhawk's. Everything we know is useless there. Then what should we do? The three bosses have already spent a lot of money. Lester didn't feel any pressure. The money was in his pocket. What he did next was up to him to decide. Our employers want us to build a friendly relationship with the sovereign and strike up a deal. His assistants doubted it would be that easy. It wasn't a simple task to make the sovereign bend their rules. The international flight from Warhawk to Annapolis took 5 hours. Not just anyone could meet with the sovereign, and Lester only had a few connections in the U.S. He applied to visit Tina and Cade in jail, hoping that the news would reach the sovereign and prompt him to contact him. The director of the local administration department was sitting in his office, drinking tea with his legs crossed, when his secretary burst through the door. "A lawyer from overseas is here to visit Tina and Cade." "The Leviathan unit is overseeing this case," the director said. "Why is he coming to us?" "I don't know. Should we report this to the higher-ups?" "He's just a lawyer. We shouldn't make a big deal out of nothing." "But he could be more than just a lawyer. Maybe he's their accomplice." The director stood up abruptly. His secretary's speculation reminded him to never be too careful. It was better to kill 1,000 people than to let one go. He straightened his tie and went downstairs to the reception room. "The law states that Miss Tina and Mr. Cade have a right to a lawyer," Lester said after the pleasantries were out of the way. The director nodded with a fake smile. "They're not here. I'll bring you to see them." He pretended to call his secretary to arrange a car. He'd contacted the Leviathan unit before coming down. The Leviathan unit was efficient and worked fast. In the time it took for the director to head downstairs, they'd already investigated Lester's background. He was an experienced legal consultant. His specialty was business mergers and reorganization, but he rarely handled criminal cases. Putting 2 and 2 together, the Leviathan unit guessed that Lester was here on behalf of the 3 bosses from Silver Shield Corporation. They informed Stephen, and he went to the local administration department to meet the lawyer. Lester had met many big shots before, so he wasn't intimidated when the sovereign himself walked into the reception room. "Mr. Adams, I didn't expect to see you here. When will I be able to meet Miss Tina and Mr. Cade?" "You can't until you receive permission," Stephen replied, sitting across from him. This was within Lester's expectations. His 3 employers wanted to strike a deal with Stephen. They didn't care about Tina and Cade. Anything could be negotiated as long as the sovereign agreed to their request. Lester had rehearsed his opening speech on the plane. His goal was to leave an impression on Stephen. "Mr. Adams, your intelligence network is as incredible as the rumors. You probably know everything there is to know about me, correct? The 3 owners of Silver Shield Corporation hired me and asked me to come to the U.S., but I'm not here for those 2 criminals." Stephen welcomed his straightforward introduction. It saved him the trouble of guessing his motives. "It doesn't matter what your purpose is. You're welcome to visit our country as long as you don't have ill intentions." "Thank you," Lester said. "On behalf of my employers, I'd like to discuss a beneficial transaction for both of us." He told Stephen everything without hiding a single detail. It hadn't been long since the explosion of the Silver Shield Corporation's factory in Cadiz. It seemed like the 3 bosses thought they'd avoided the spotlight, so they were ready to make another move. Stephen had no intention of keeping the biochemical technology and the sacred manual a secret. The research on biochemical technology wasn't theirs to begin with. It was Warhawk's. As for the ancient text, Stephen had laid eyes on the sacred manual but gained nothing because his cultivation wasn't high enough. "Your employers are ambitious. They haven't given up even after all these failures. However, the biochemical technology is incomplete. You won't be able to do much with it. Let's talk about the ancient text instead." Lester was delighted to hear that. His employers didn't match up to Stephen in terms of status. Having the chance to discuss specifics of the deal was an achievement in itself. Stephen continued. "I purchased books from around the world with a focus on historical heritage. As you may have guessed, it took a lot of money before I found the ancient text. It outlines clues to a brand new civilization. If it's implemented properly, a new chapter will begin for mankind." As a top lawyer, Lester was rational and logical. When he heard the news that the U.S. had found an ancient text, he thought it was all a ruse. But now that he was talking to the sovereign face to face, he didn't seem to be lying. As the sovereign, he wouldn't risk his reputation to brag about something that didn't exist. When Lester asked what the price would be sufficient for the ancient text, Stephen told him about the martial arts competition. Tina and Cade's bodyguards were mediocre at best. Rather than participating in a competition they couldn't win, the three bosses' best bet was to spend their money to sponsor the event. Their pockets were deep, and any problem that could be resolved with money was considered a win in their book. Sure enough, Lester readily agreed. Our initial estimates amount to several billion, Stephen explained. When the project is officially underway, I'll give you a more detailed outline of the precise breakdown. You can discuss this with your employers. I understand. I'll relay your message. Just as Lester was about to get up and leave, Stephen stopped him. Since we're cooperating with each other, pulling small tricks is no longer necessary. Tell your employers to take care of the mutated sea creatures near our waters. This would save the Research Institute time and energy because they wouldn't need to research and develop drugs to deal with the mutation anymore. I'll let them know, Lester said before heading out. The meeting went smoothly, but even Stephen thought his offer was too much. Building a fighting ring required mostly manual labor. The building materials, construction team, and equipment weren't that hard to acquire, and it certainly wasn't worth billions. Salim walked into the room. From what he's saying, the owners of Silver Shield Corporation are in Warhawk. Should we tell the Leviathan Unit's intelligence team to locate them? That's not necessary, Stephen said. We made a deal. They'll be cleaning up the ocean and sending us the money we need in exchange for information about the sacred manual. To them, that's the key to an eternal life of money, fame, and status. They won't give that up for the world. Days had passed since Harry and Rebecca's arrest. There was still no update from the government. Farola was getting impatient. He sent the head of the Hearst family to a local police station to ask around. A higher-level department has taken over the case, the head of the family informed him when he returned. They don't know anything. Maybe the Sovereign is covering up for them. On the surface, he pretends to be righteous, Farola muttered. But behind everyone's backs, he shows favoritism to his relatives. The head of the Hearst family originally planned to become the second monopoly at the Eastern Port with Farola's help, but things weren't going as smoothly as he had expected. After Harry and Rebecca were arrested, there haven't been any new business opportunities at the Eastern Port. The government's management is even stricter than before. Are we still sticking with our plan? No, we'll have to use a more forceful method. Compared to the Cassidy family, the Sovereign has a better relationship with the Fallon family. DeAndre Fallon and Ron Fallon were involved in Harry and Rebecca's business. They're not that talented when it comes to martial arts. We'll take them as hostages and gauge the Sovereign's reaction. After hiding at the Eastern Port for some time, Farola's team was glad they were finally resorting to more direct methods. This included the head of the Hearst family. The Cassidy family was in Washington, D.C., and they weren't that far away from the port. Their group set off on a private jet to the district. As the plane ascended above the clouds, the head of the Hearst family glared at his immature son sitting next to him. You don't know how to do anything except cause problems. We wouldn't have been dragged into this mess if it weren't for you. His son wasn't listening. His mind was filled with thoughts of eating, drinking, and having fun with women. What's the big deal? Let them do what they want. It's a win-win situation. When both sides lose from the conflict, we'll take over and reap the benefits for ourselves. The head of the Hearst family was at a loss for words because of his stupid son. Their family was nothing compared to Farola's team, the Sovereign, or the Cassidy family. How was his son expecting them to toy with all these forces and survive the aftermath? The once glorious mansion of the Cassidy family was desolate and bleak after DeAndre's birthday celebration. Everyone knew that the Sovereign wasn't interested in their family. Even if there were some familial ties between them, it wasn't significant enough to make a difference. In addition, Harry and Rebecca had committed a long list of crimes at the Eastern Port. Perhaps the Cassidy family's history would soon turn to dust. A black luxury car stopped outside the entrance of the Cassidy family's mansion. Farola looked out the window at the tightly shut door. Branches and leaves littered the yard. There weren't even security guards patrolling the premises. What's going on? Did the Cassidy family abandon their mansion? Maybe they're keeping a low profile to keep themselves out of trouble, one of his teammates said. Let's monitor them for now and decide who to take later. The head of the Cassidy family, DeAndre, and his nephew Ron were in the mansion's study, drinking bitter tea with a frown on their faces. Earning money was useless. There was no progress with Harry and Rebecca's investigation. The Cassidy family's lawyer was sitting across from them, giving his assessment. From a legal perspective, disruption of the market and threatening competitors results in a huge fine and a sentence of about 5 years. Their most serious crimes are conspiring with foreign forces and betraying the country. Unfortunately, Silver Shield Corporation failed, and Dr. Dalton's team is safe. If anything happened to them, Harry and Rebecca would have rotted in prison for the rest of their lives. The Cassidy family had lost 2 of their potential successors at the same time, and Kim wasn't interested in getting involved with their family affairs. DeAndre sighed. "When can we see them?" "After the investigation is over," the lawyer said. "There are too many national secrets involved in their case. They're only allowing their lawyers to consult with them. My advice to you is to listen to the sovereign and wait for the results. Getting them out of prison is no longer possible. Your priority should be revitalizing the family business. Run the company yourself until it's stable." The Leviathan Unit's investigation team was in Washington, D.C. to confirm Harry and Rebecca's statements. During their confession, they'd mentioned several companies under the Cassidy and Fallon families' names. According to the other family lawyers, the Leviathan Unit didn't find anything significant. After dinner, DeAndre and Ron took a stroll in the garden. Farola watched them from the shadows. The bodyguards inside the mansion were average. They posed no threat to his team. "Capture the 2 targets and leave them in the southwestern direction. Then hide in the forest. The local police station in the district doesn't have anyone particularly capable. We can avoid them." With the operations details laid out, his team leaped over the gates and made their move. Cadis's officials were trustworthy, or rather, it was more accurate to say that they didn't have the courage to play tricks on the sovereign. They wired $30 billion into the United States' accounts, and a steady stream of ships loaded with ores entered the eastern port. Cadis was just one of the many neighboring countries restricting the United States' international business development. Next on the list was the island state. They were located approximately 200 nautical miles away from Cadis. Stephen planned to limit their trade and give them a taste of their own medicine. Wes and Aston had followed Kim to Cadis, and their farmland was in the process of being restructured. While Stephen was reviewing documents at his desk, his phone rang. It was the director of Washington, D.C.'s local police station. He was calling to inform him that 2 members of the Cassidy family were kidnapped. Stephen frowned as he listened. For such a major incident to happen right under his nose, there must have been a loophole in his security. How did that happen? It's strange for the Cassidy family to be so vulnerable. After receiving the report, I led a team to their mansion to investigate. There were a total of 28 bodies at the scene. They were in the family's bodyguards and staff. The culprit left a note stating that they kidnapped DeAndre Fallon and Ron Fallon. I believe the culprit wants to negotiate, not annihilate the Cassidy family. Washington, D.C. was put under martial law. The military searched the entire district, but couldn't find any leads. The timing of the incident wasn't in Stephen's favor. It hadn't been long since Harry and Rebecca's arrest. If news got out, people would think he was trying to suppress the Cassidy family. Stephen decided to look for DeAndre and Ron himself. Before heading to Washington, D.C., he went to the training grounds with Noor. This was a good opportunity to take Tristan and Zane outside for some fresh air. They seemed bored the last time he saw them. Soon, the 4 of them were in an off-road vehicle speeding along the highway in Washington, D.C.'s direction. There was no tension in the air. Everyone was treating this trip like a short vacation. Zane clenched and unclenched his fist. I hope the culprit is stronger than the guards at Cloudcrest Manor. I haven't had the chance to test my new body in a real fight. I think you'll be more than satisfied. There's a lot of people who know about my relationship with the Cassidy family. Not just anyone would attempt a kidnapping at a time like this. Stephen had a feeling that this case was aimed at him. The Cassidy family had declined greatly. Targeting DeAndre and Ron wasn't worth the hassle if the culprit was after money. The director of the local police station in the district waited for Stephen at the entrance. He'd sent out his direct subordinates and contacted the military for assistance in the investigation. When Stephen and his team stepped out of the vehicle, the director went over to greet them with a smile. "Did you find anything?" Stephen asked. "We found a piece of cloth that belongs to the Fallon family's unique clothing in the forest to the southwest." It seemed like the culprit wasn't that skilled. DeAndre and Ron's martial arts were average, and bringing them along to the wilderness would only drag the culprit down. "Contact the local media channels and tell them to announce that the Sovereign is in Washington, D.C. for an inspection," Stephen instructed. "The culprit will hear about it, and maybe they'll reveal themselves on their own." The forest at night was terrifying. Wild beasts howled in the darkness. Lighting a bonfire did nothing to calm DeAndre and Ron's nerves. Their captives' cooking techniques were crude. They placed a half-eaten cooked roasted meat in front of them. "We've been on the run for a while," DeAndre said. "Can't we sit down and have a talk? If it's money you want, we can give that to you." Farola threw them a cold look, not bothering to respond. One of his teammates took over. "Eat your fill and spend the rest of the night in the cave. We won't tell you twice." DeAndre and Ron kept their mouths shut and did as they were told. The grass rustled as they reached for the meat. A silver wolf dashed into the clearing. Its scarlet eyes and fangs gleamed under the moonlight. The aroma of barbecued meat had lured the wolf to the bonfire. Farola picked up a tree branch and stirred it in the fire. The end of the branch burned with flames as he pulled away and threw it at the wolf. The instant the branch touched the wolf, it exploded from the inside out, and a pungent smell filled the air. The Tribulation Sect members were used to this. They skinned the wolf to use its fur as a blanket and planned to roast the wolf's meat for dinner. One of the members was on his phone, and he came across a news article about the Sovereign. "There's no mistake. The Sovereign is here for us. Let's beat those two half to death and use them as bait to lure them here." "Don't be careless," Farola warned. "The Sovereign killed Sermil." There were rumors that the Sovereign was the strongest martial artist in the country, but the Tribulation Sect weren't pushovers. Farola was eager to have a match with him. While they were whispering, gunshots rang out through the forest. A group of villagers with hunting rifles surrounded them. "That wolf was our prey. We've been tracking it for days. From your attire, you're outsiders who don't know the rules around here. Put down the wolf's pelt and meat and get out of here." Farola stared at the villagers. He never thought a day like this would come, where an ordinary person would threaten him so boldly. Just as the villagers raised their rifles and the Tribulation Sect members stepped forward, Farola intervened and tossed his talismans at the villagers. They phased through their chests and went inside them. A strange force dulled their minds. Their eyes clouded, and their arms fell to their sides. "Do the same thing with the rest of the villagers," Farola ordered his team. "We'll use them to lure the Sovereign to us." During the next few days, the police and the military had a hard time tracking down the culprit behind DeAndre and Ron's kidnapping. One of the teams had vanished into thin air. The director had a bad feeling about this and went to report the incident to Stephen. "There's something strange about the village on the other side of the forest. We lost contact with one of our teams there." Stephen suspected that the culprit was behind their disappearance. He rounded up his team and set off for the village. Farola's team had taken over the village. Every villager was under the effects of a talisman, turning into mindless puppets. The talismans intertwined with the villagers' spiritual energy and made it hard for other people, including martial artists, to sense their presence. The Tribulation Sect members on patrol reported to Farola. "The Sovereign and his people are outside the village." That was fast. How many people did he bring with him? "There are 2 black SUVs. "He's confident in himself," Farola said thoughtfully. "Let's teach him a lesson he'll never forget." Stephen, Noor, Tristan, and Zane got out of the car to investigate. The director and his subordinates stayed outside the village to keep an eye on the situation. During the past few days, the villagers had holed up at home. Occasionally, some of them would go out to the fields to confuse outsiders. Noor sensed the strange atmosphere after taking 2 steps into the village. It was eerily quiet. There's no one around. At this time of day, the villagers should be out and about. Stephen gestured to a house nearby. "I'll go and ask what's going on." He walked up to the house with Noor, Tristan, and Zane hung back to avoid intimidating the villagers. Stephen knocked on the door for several minutes before a couple in plain clothes stepped out. "Hello, I'm sorry for bothering you. We're from the government, and we'd like to ask you a few questions." The couple looked past Stephen at his group before their gazes flitted back to his face. Without warning, they pulled out their sickles, aiming for his neck. Their movements were lightning fast, and their strength was astonishing. Stephen took 3 steps back and stopped the sickles with a finger pressed to the blade. Before he could snatch the weapons out of their hands, the sickles shattered into small fragments. They shot towards his head. An ambush at such a close distance was impossible to avoid. Stephen condensed the energy inside the killin's core, and a veil of flame swirled around him. The fragments melted upon contact and clattered to the ground. The 2 villagers were burnt to a crisp. Noor came over, glaring at the charred bodies. He hadn't seen the surprise attack coming either. No wonder they were acting so weird. The entire village is strange. All of the villagers are probably in on it. We should just kill them all. Before he could do anything, every door in the village opened. A crowd of villagers surged towards them with farming tools in their hands. The talismans enhanced their tools, and they were sturdy and sharp like real weapons. The 2 burnt villagers jumped to their feet, joining the crowd. "Be careful," Stephen warned. "They should have been killed when my flames touched them. There's a strange power clinging to them. A martial artist is hiding in the area." Just as he and Noor were about to take down the villagers, Tristan sauntered over. With a wave of his hand, the villagers dropped to the ground one by one. The talismans tore through their torsos and gathered in his hand. "So, our new friends from the Tribulation sect are behind this," Tristan said sarcastically. "I was wondering who would have the time and energy to come up with so many long-winded plans." The meticulous trap that Farola set up was ruined in an instant. His team, who'd been watching from a distance, threw their talismans at Stephen's group and jumped out of their hiding place. They brandished their swords and rushed to attack. Stephen and his group leapt into action. Their weapons clashed, and shockwaves swept through the village, toppling the houses. Stephen observed the men in black robes and their talismans. They were members of the Tribulation sect, but judging from the color of their robes, they weren't the ringleader. He didn't know if DeAndre and Ron were still alive, but one thing was for sure. Now that they'd fallen into the hands of the Tribulation sect, they wouldn't have a good ending. Stephen met Noor's gaze, silently signaling for him to search for DeAndre and Ron. Noor nodded and slipped away from the crowd. As for Tristan and Zane, they were having the time of their lives. Fighting was the best form of entertainment. The Tribulation sect didn't have any information on Zane. They treated him like one of the Sovereign's followers, but after exchanging blows, they realized he wasn't an ordinary lackey. Zane's punches and kicks were accompanied by flashes of lightning. A dull rumble like thunder rang out with every strike. "You're weak. 3 punches and 2 kicks are all it takes to knock you down. If I knew this was going to happen, I wouldn't have ditched my comfortable clothes for this tight uniform." The Tribulation sect scrambled to their feet and put some distance between them. Zane was too strong. Every attack from him was paralyzing. A man cloaked in red walked out from one of the houses and stopped in front of Stephen. "You've finally shown yourself. I was wondering how long it'd take." Farola grinned. "Arrogant brat. I'll put you in your place." The remnant effects of the talisman activated. The villagers' bodies dissolved into pools of blood, spreading across the ground. The entire village became a sea of blood within minutes. It was like a scene taken straight out of a horror movie. The blood evaporated into a red mist, shrouding the village from sight. Farola opened his mouth, absorbing the mist inside him and increasing his strength. He unsheathed his sword, training his gaze on Stephen. "You're proud of yourself for killing a cardinal, right? You just got lucky. It won't happen again." The red mist seemed to have a life of its own. It drifted through the air and surrounded Stephen. This was a technique he'd seen before. The ancient martial artist he fought in Tristan's tower had used a similar technique. Stephen had used the insight he'd gained from that battle to create his own. He unleashed a torrent of blue flames that spread throughout the village. His and Ferola's domains clashed as the flames and blood collided, trying to overpower the other. Your domain relies on your inner energy, Ferola pointed out. Its effects are restricted by your cultivation. But mine is different. I extracted the villagers' blood and their resentment to create it. You're out of my league. Stephen manifested his 7 gems and tossed them into the air. He infused his inner energy into them, and they transformed into phantom dragons of fire. I've fought with the Tribulation sect before. You have no techniques besides your talismans. Ferola was infuriated, feeling like his reputation was being challenged. He attacked without warning, but the dragons were more powerful than an artillery shell. His arms were numb from one exchange. Ferola couldn't help but marvel at Stephen's martial arts, but at the time, he became more cautious. The sea of blood churned violently. The waves towered over Stephen. He bent his knees, planning to jump out of range, but when he leaped off the ground, the air became thinner the higher he went. It was like he'd entered a vacuum. The red mist had absorbed the spiritual energy in the air. If you don't want to suffocate, then stay on the ground, Ferola called out, leaping into the air after him. Stephen transmitted more of his inner energy to his domain, but it was on the ground and did nothing for him in the skies. He had no choice but to block Ferola's sword with his phantoms. You can drag this out as much as you want, but you've lost this battle. Stephen had assessed the situation on the ground while he was ascending. Ferola's team was no match for Tristan and Zane. Every time they were about to use their talismans to amplify their strength, they would mysteriously disappear from their hands. Tristan casually tossed another stolen talisman to Zane, who had countless talismans scattered around his feet. Stop throwing me their trash, Zane grumbled as he caught the talisman. You're blaming the wrong person, Tristan said defensively. They like to carry scrap metal with them. It's not my fault they don't have any other techniques. Zane scoffed. He crushed the talisman with his fist in a burst of electricity, rendering it useless and dissipating its effects. The Tribulation sect members lost the ability to control their own talismans. This is hopeless. Let's go back to Mr. Ferola. Where did that martial artist come from? His techniques are completely different from the Sovereign and the Leviathan unit. Stop wasting time with pointless questions. Our lives are more important. They turned and ran in the opposite direction, but Tristan and Zane were faster. They wiped them out in a flurry of violent attacks. The tables had turned, and Ferola was outnumbered. Stephen leaped back, disengaging from the confrontation. He called out to Tristan and Zane. If you two are done, then help me deal with him. Break his domain. Zane condensed a 60-feet-long spear made of electricity and plunged the tip into the ground. A deafening explosion rocked the village, leaving behind a crater 500 feet deep. The bottom of the crater was hazy. A powerful suction force pulled the sea of blood into the pit, returning the ground to normal. Ferola was so stunned that he couldn't care less about his dead teammates. He stared at Zane in disbelief, trying to figure out why he was so strong. Who are you? Tristan interjected. If you want to know, then ask him in the afterlife. He replicated his shadows and melted into them. Ferola frowned, increasing his speed to dash out of range. Tristan was nowhere in sight, but he could feel his gaze boring into his back. Stephen had seen Tristan use this technique before. Ferola wouldn't be able to get rid of his shadow, or throw Tristan off his tail. Nor returned after searching the village and the outer perimeter of the forest. There's no sign of DeAndre and Ron. Maybe the Tribulation sect took them elsewhere. That made things complicated. Stephen didn't care too much about them, but they were Kim's family. Based on the Tribulation sect member they'd captured in the past, Ferola was unlikely to reveal their locations. They could kill him and search the forest afterwards, but they would have to make sure that Ferola was the only Tribulation sect member left in the area to remove the threat from DeAndre and Ron's side. Ferola threw out more than 100 talismans. They attached themselves to his body, forming an indestructible armor. A cardinal's talismans were much stronger than the rest of its members. Their effects remained even after coming into contact with Zane's fist. A numbing sensation shot up Zane's arm. His blood vessels felt like they were about to burst open. He sighed in exasperation. His body couldn't keep up with him. It would probably break if he exerted his strength one more time. Zane changed tactics. He condensed blades of lightning that targeted the gaps between the talismans. Most of the lightning was absorbed, while the remaining brute force staggered Farola slightly, but it didn't have much of an impact. His armor renewed his confidence. The shadow behind Farola leapt out of the ground, and he subconsciously slashed at the mass with his sword. When he pierced the shadow, there was no blood. It slithered up the blade, slipped through the gaps in the talismans, and stained his skin. "What the hell is this?" Tristan's voice echoed from every direction. "You'll know soon enough. I guarantee it'll become an unforgettable experience." Farola scanned his body with his inner energy, but his condition was normal. The black stain hadn't done anything, but he couldn't remove it. Stephen and Nor snuck up behind Farola and slashed at his wrists and ankles. His armor was sturdy, but it didn't cover every part of his body. The exposed areas were still as fragile as before. Farola easily parried with swords of his own. Stephen and Nor leapt back. Every time their weapons brushed against the talismans, their inner energy and aura were absorbed. Tristan reappeared next to Zane. "It's about time," he called out. "Let's go." Stephen glanced back in confusion. "What? Are you for real?" Farola was surrounded. This was their best chance to restrain him. But Tristan nodded with a serious expression that was rarely seen on his face. He was always fooling around, but not right now. Stephen motioned for Nor to retreat. Farola called after them. "Where are you going? Don't you want your hostages back? If we kill the head of the Cassidy family, your career as the sovereign is over. If you can't protect your family, then what right do you have to manage the country?" Stephen hesitated and turned around. "Stop beating around the bush. Why did you kidnap them?" "You know the answer. Give me the sacred manual, and I'll tell you where they are." "And you think 2 hostages are worth the bargain?" Tristan stepped in front of Stephen and patted his shoulder. "Let's leave. I'll tell you why once we get out of here." Stephen gritted his teeth. "Fine, let's go." He couldn't understand why Tristan kept telling them to leave, but he followed him out of the ruined village anyway. They drove back to Washington, D.C., accomplishing nothing. At the police station, Tristan finally answered the question everyone was wondering about. Shadow technique works the same way as the 2-dimensional seal. As the black stain spreads, his body will turn into a shadow. The stain has no weight. It's flat. Tristan's technique contained spatial attributes, which were quite rare to come by. "Can the stain be removed?" Stephen asked. "For example, using light to repel the darkness?" "No. Once it's on his skin, it's there for life. He can't get rid of it, even if he cuts off his flesh." Tristan's plan was to drive Farola into a corner. When the stain spread, he would fear for his life and run over to submit willingly. The hasty end to today's battle and the waiting game made Stephen impatient, but there was nothing he could do but wait. The tense atmosphere in Washington, D.C. remained, even when the sovereign overseeing the situation. The well-informed, wealthy families knew that DeAndre and Ron were still missing. They began to worry. Any of them could be the next target. Some of them left the district and went to Annapolis, where it was safer. Stephen was temporarily staying at a hotel. When he returned to his room after the briefing at the police station, he received a call from Kim. She was far away in Cadiz, but she'd heard about what happened with DeAndre and Ron.
"Are there any leads?"
"Not yet. I hate to say this, but don't get your hopes up. The culprit isn't easy to deal with. He's almost as strong as me and my people." Kim remained calm. Panicking wouldn't help anyone, and Stephen was probably more anxious than she was since he was directly involved in the case. She clung to the hope that DeAndre and Ron were important hostages that the culprit couldn't afford to kill, at least not until he got what he wanted. "I'll do my best to bring them home safely," Stephen said. "But just understand that even if they come back, they won't be able to maintain the family for long."
"Thank you, Stephen. Don't push yourself too hard."
Kim changed the topic to the construction projects in Cadiz. She and her team had been making steady progress. The U.S. kept a few of their warships stationed at the coastal port, so Cadiz's officials treated Kim like the second sovereign. The public approved of her as well. She offered high salaries and hired those in need of money. Many people in Cadis heard about her projects and came up with all kinds of ways to promote themselves, hoping for her to hire them. That's a great start, Stephen praised.
You don't plan to be lenient with Cadis's royal family at all?
Kim asked. I gave them a choice and more than one chance. They made their decision, and this is the consequence. But this benefits both of our countries, so they're not really losing all that much, except not having a choice when it comes to international trade. The shipping companies at the eastern port were free to do business with Cadis. Stephen had already told the officer in charge of customs to provide them with funds. Has anyone been giving you trouble?
Wes and Aston follow me everywhere outside,
Kim said with a laugh.
They glare at everyone who comes a little too close. Don't worry about me. I'm doing fine.
Stephen broke into a smile for the first time that day. That's good to hear. If it weren't for the mountain of issues he had to take care of here, he would have definitely gone to Cadis with her. After Stephen's group left the village, Farola returned to the cave. He was the sole survivor of this team. DeAndre and Ron were huddling in the corner of the cave. Restraints had been fastened around their ankles, chaining them to the wall. When they saw the dejected look on Farola's face, they could more or less guess what had happened. If your conditions aren't too excessive, there is still room for negotiation with Stephen, DeAndre said. Farola scowled at them. Shut it. You two are worthless. What do you mean? Ron asked in disbelief. Is Stephen abandoning us? Farola didn't answer. He walked out of the cave and sat next to the bonfire. He held out his arm to examine the black stain. It didn't hurt or itch. He ran his hand over the stain, but there was no bump. It was like a tattoo. When Farola tried to wipe the stain from his skin with a cloth, nothing happened. He tried different methods like cutting his skin and burning the stain, but nothing worked. The stain was spreading, showing no signs of stopping. He circulated his inner energy to probe the area, but there was no feedback. The stain had no connection with his body. No wonder Stephen's group left in such a hurry. Farola's sour mood worsened after finding out that he'd been played, but he didn't joke around when it came to his own life. He planned to sneak his way back to Washington, D.C. Then he would either threaten Tristan for an antidote or negotiate with Stephen directly. In the middle of the night, Tristan sensed an unusual presence in the district. He woke everyone up, and they gathered in Stephen's hotel room. Farola's heading this way. Nor looked out the window, scanning the empty streets for intruders. He wants to attack us by himself? He doesn't know his own limits. Maybe the stain pressured him, Tristan said. He thinks he'll die if he doesn't get rid of it as soon as possible. Either way, this proves that he doesn't have backup. The four of them went out to the balcony and leaped onto the rooftop. Stephen connected his vision to the gems to search for Farola. When Farola set foot in the district, he'd released his aura to search for Stephen's group. He was at the late stages of the immortal realm, and it wasn't hard for him to lock onto their location at the hotel. It only took him a few minutes to make it to the hotel's premises. Zane sent a burst of wind in his direction. A clap of thunder echoed beside Farola's ear as the wind whistled past. He staggered from the explosive sound. Stephen and the rest leaped off the rooftop and landed on the ground, slashing at Farola without giving him a chance to speak. There was no chance for him to negotiate. He gathered his inner energy as the second battle ensued. Stephen, don't you want to talk about this? Farola managed to say as he dodged another heavy sword strike. Your reputation is tied to the Cassidy family. Do you not care about your relatives? Harry and Rebecca had negatively affected Stephen's reputation when they were arrested, and it would be much worse if news of DeAndre and Ron's kidnapping spread. Stephen didn't slow down. He swung even faster. As the Sovereign, one word from him, and the media would look the other way. Zane's fist was as quick as lightning. He landed a blow on Farola's back. Farola was using the talismans as armor again, but even that couldn't offset the full impact. Tristan coordinated with Zane and darted back and forth in front of Farola. No one knew what he was doing, but a minute later, Farola let out a blood-curdling scream and clutched his face. Tristan had plucked out his eyeballs. Stephen couldn't let Farola live. He didn't have a backup, and from the way he kept threatening his reputation using DeAndre and Ron's lives, there was a chance they were still alive. The talismans were mysterious and capable of anything. As long as Farola was alive, anything was possible. There was a risk of him using his talismans to escape and going back to wherever DeAndre and Ron were to finish them off. The best option was to kill Farola while he was distracted, without giving him a chance to do anything else. Stephen laced his swords with flames and pierced Farola's throat. His internal organs were reduced to ashes. Another cardinal was dead. The only reason Stephen managed to kill a martial artist at the later stages of the immortal realm was because Tristan and Zane were around. If they weren't here, who knew what the outcome would have been? The Tribulation Sect was a powerful ancient martial arts faction. There was no end to their ambushes. Farola's team had been wiped out, but it was only a matter of time before they sent another team to take their place. They might already be on their way here, and there was no telling what they would do this time. "We need to make sure we have the advantage by taking the initiative," Noor said when they were back at the hotel. "Let's have the police search for DeAndre and Ron. We'll go back to Annapolis and prepare for the competition." "I can't just give up on Kim's family when she's waiting for them," Stephen argued. "The Tribulation Sect is crafty. Who knows where they took them? The forest is huge. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. Whether we're involved in the search or not, nothing will change. Let's trust the police and let them take care of it." Noor was right, and Stephen could only agree. The pressure fell on the director of the local police station. If DeAndre and Ron were alive, he would need to bring them back safely. If they were dead, he would need to bring back their bodies. If he didn't find anything, his career would be over. The famous lawyer from Warhawk, Lester, returned to his country to inform the three bosses of Silver Shield Corporation about the deal. Becoming a sponsor for the upcoming martial arts competition meant that Stephen wouldn't be holding them accountable for the mess at the Eastern Port. It could also be considered spending money to buy their safety. Zorvis was pleased with the results. "We're glad we hired you. This deal is brilliant. All we need to do is transfer the money to the United States' account, right? Is there anything else?" "Aren't you interested in the competition?" Lester asked. "The Sovereign looked down on your martial arts, but he didn't say you can't participate." Stephen had promised that the prize for winning the competition would be information on the ancient text, but he never specified what the sponsors would receive. After spending this much money, it wouldn't be worth it to just walk away empty-handed. "Our friend has offered us martial artists from a security company," Juno said. "They're not the strongest, but they're the best we have for now." "There's no hurry. You have time to decide." Lester left after fulfilling his duty, and the three of them began to seriously consider participating in the competition. If they won, they would receive information on the ancient texts, and Stephen would also reevaluate their value. Maybe future commercial projects with the U.S. would be smoother as well. "Where are we going to find a top martial artist?" Mike asked. "Don't forget that when Tina and Cade were arrested, their bodyguards were arrested with them. That wouldn't have happened if they were capable." Lester had requested the U.S. authorities to release them on bail, but he was denied. They wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. "Let's go ask Hillskin for help," Zorvis suggested. "We need trained fighters with years of experience, and soldiers in the military fit that criteria." Juno and Mike were doubtful. "Are you sure those people can compete with martial artists?" Zorvis nodded. "Warhawk isn't a fool. If they weren't confident in winning the battle at the northern border, why would they have gotten involved in that mess? The outcome was disappointing, but their strength is the real deal." They didn't have any other options, so Juno and Mike called Hillskin to arrange a meeting. They also gathered $2 billion in sponsorship funds and sent it to the United States' account not long after. Stephen called Salim over when he returned to Annapolis. Salim had chosen the venue for the competition, so he'd taken responsibility for the arena's construction. "We've received the sponsorship. How's the construction going?" Salim turned on the computer and pulled up an image of a cylindrical platform on the screen. "The arena will be constructed using the toughest alloy with seamless processing to contain the destruction. On the outside, the Leviathan unit can set up a defensive array to limit the strength of the contestants." Stephen was satisfied with the layout. If the participants weren't allowed to use weapons and were limited to their fists, The arena would suffice. Salim changed the screen to a list of security guards on Mirage Island. Many of them were familiar faces. They were prisoners with the AI chip implanted. "What hasn't been completed?" Stephen asked. The audience seats and the participants' waiting rooms. We're drawing up a comfortable and lavish design because our own people will be watching the competition too. Salim had taken everything into consideration, so Stephen left the rest to him. With that out of the way, the next step was to ask the media to advertise the competition. After that, they would need to invite the ancient martial arts factions. Everyone else who signed up would be welcomed, but the Leviathan unit's intelligence team had to investigate their background to weed out those with malicious intentions as best as they could. 2 days later, the police found DeAndre and Ron in a cave deep in the forest. They were chained to the interior walls, but they were long enough for them to wander outside the cave. They survived on fruits and mountain spring water. After giving their statements at the local police station, they left for Annapolis. The Cassidy family had property there, and it was much safer than in Washington, D.C. As for their businesses in the district, they handed them over to professional managers. DeAndre couldn't stop feeling uneasy, even as he was sitting in the garden, sipping his tea. "Stephen doesn't think of our family as his own. He won't help us unless Kim steps in, but she's far away in Cadiz. I don't know when she's coming back." Ron was relatively calm. He wasn't the head of the Fallon family, so he didn't have too much responsibility. "Stephen's attitude towards our family does affect our business, but Harry and Rebecca's case isn't over yet. Let's wait and see what happens." The two of them didn't have the courage to request another meeting with Stephen, so the only thing left for them to do was to contact their old friends in Annapolis and look for other business opportunities. Unlike what DeAndre and Ron assumed, Stephen did play a role in their rescue. He'd instructed the Leviathan unit and the palace to help the police search for them. After they were found, he'd informed Kim of their safe return to reassure her and asked the Leviathan unit to secretly guard the Cassidy family's mansion and their other properties. Dr. Dalton and his team had been working at the Underground Research Institute for a while, but they didn't make any significant breakthroughs. The body they'd developed was above average for normal martial artists, but for someone like Zane, it was too fragile to withstand his cultivation. There was no progress with the body, but the chips they'd implanted in Amber and Mitty returned valuable information. Dr. Dalton went to Stephen's office to report. "Warhawk is making their move again. They failed to support Cadiz when they were asked for help with compensation, so they're going to make a mess of your wife's projects to suppress the country's collaboration with the U.S. Stephen knew Warhawk's higher-ups would never give up, but he didn't expect them to be so fast. Their defeat at the northern border wasn't that long ago. As he carefully reviewed the information, he was surprised to find that their tactics were familiar. Warhawk is implanting AI chips in their prisoners' brains, and they're sending them to Cadiz to sacrifice themselves. From a technical perspective, that's similar to what we're doing now, except our prisoners are either guarding the island or reading books." Stephen suspected that information was being leaked. Maybe Warhawk had planted a spy by his side. Dr. Dalton knew what he was thinking. The Leviathan unit carries out frequent investigations at our lab, so there can't be spies there. Warhawk's technology had always been advanced. Dr. Dalton's breakthroughs were mostly because of the information they'd obtained from Amber and Mitty. It wasn't unusual for Warhawk to have caught up so soon. Stephen's concerns were dispelled. Now he had to figure out how to stop the attack in Cadiz. "Warhawk's ship will be arriving at Cadiz's port within the next few days," Dr. Dalton explained. "The modified prisoners will blend in with Warhawk's tourists and enter the country without drawing attention to themselves. Then they're going to ruin your wife's projects. The situation is urgent, and it would be best for her to return to Annapolis immediately." Stephen didn't think that was necessary. He called Wes and Aston and informed them of the situation. He would be heading there himself soon. The U.S. was in a period of chaos. After the media announced the martial arts competition, some people resorted to more aggressive methods to steal the ancient text. At the same time, Warhawk's ship was estimated to arrive at Cadiz's port at 10 p.m. 3 days later. There wasn't much time for Stephen to prepare. There were many issues he needed to deal with in Annapolis, and the people who were plotting to steal the ancient text had to be monitored. He left these tasks to the Leviathan unit and asked Tristan and Zane to protect his people while he was away. Then he took Trey with him and boarded a private jet to Cadiz. As the plane was ascending, Trey looked around at the empty seats. They were the only ones on board. Shouldn't we bring more people with us? What happened to your spark of bravery when we fought the Killin? Stephen teased. Trey straightened his back and declared confidently, "Don't worry, Mr. Adams. If it comes down to it, I'll protect you with my life." Life on the ocean was pleasant and serene, but it was also dull and monotonous. Trey always felt like something was missing and that there was more to the world than the endless ocean over the horizon. Ever since he became a member of the Empyrean Circle, he'd encountered more than one life-and-death experience on the battlefield, and had even had one of his arms torn off. But this kind of fast-paced, dangerous, and exhilarating lifestyle suited his personality, and it was Stephen who'd given him the opportunity to see the world beyond the ocean. Stephen laughed. "Relax, it won't get to that point. I've thought it through." It took them 2 hours to reach Cadiz. In the suburbs where the fields stretched on for miles, Stephen finally saw Kim again. Everyone tactfully walked away to give them privacy. The two of them took a stroll along the fields. Stephen noticed that Kim was tanner than the last time he saw her. She caught him staring and waved her hands in his face. "Stop staring. When you're out in the sun for hours on end, this is what happens." "You've been applying sunscreen, right? Don't work too hard." "I am, don't worry. The work isn't too bad." Stephen scanned the fields. The construction projects were underway, and things were going well. He warned Kim about Warhawk's attack. If he couldn't control the situation, it would be safer for her to leave first. "I thought Warhawk and Cadiz were close allies," Kim said. "Now they're stabbing them in the back?" Stephen was open-minded about these things. There are no eternal friends, only eternal interests. The king of Cadiz, Javon, received news that the sovereign was in his country again. He didn't know the reason behind Stephen's sudden visit, but he couldn't help but be nervous. The sovereign came to Cadiz without prior notice. Is it because he wants a report on the contamination in the ocean? The two princes didn't think that was the case. The sovereign manages the U.S. as a whole. When would he have the time to care about trivial matters like that? "We should do as we've always done and welcome leaders of foreign countries. He tells us when we meet." Javon agreed and asked his subordinates to organize a banquet at the palace. In the evening, Javon waited at the entrance to welcome Stephen and his wife personally. He did his best to force a smile. "Welcome back to Cadiz. Our countries have collaborated on numerous projects. I hope we can continue to make a friendly relationship." Stephen nodded. "You and I share the same thoughts. I plan to invest manpower and resources to turn your port into an international financial trade zone." Kim followed up with an explanation of the details. They were so in sync that Javon misunderstood that the sovereign was here for an inspection. Cadiz was one of the largest neighboring countries of the U.S. Once they became allies, it would be easier to defend against the other countries. Stephen proposed a profitable project. "The geographical location of your coastal port makes it an ideal place for tourism. I'm planning a few cruises in the area." Javon was thrilled by the idea. He raised his glass as a toast. Back when he signed the document, he was worried that Cadiz would be impacted by the large compensation, but Stephen had taken the money to revitalize the economy in a different, more efficient way. The more Stephen invested, the more prosperous Cadiz would become. There would be more trust among the people for the royal family. "I need authority at the port's customs department to review the list of people entering and leaving the country," Stephen said. "Our government can handle those matters. You're an investor. I wouldn't want to trouble you with a small task like that." "I understand. However, I'm making this suggestion to ensure the safety of the port. Based on my intel, hostile forces will be arriving at the port in a couple of days. If you don't agree, then I can only redeploy warships in your waters." The discussion escalated in a heartbeat, and having the United States' warships in Cadiz's waters was the last thing Javon wanted. In the end, he agreed to Stephen's request and thought of it as a free security guard service. On the other side of the ocean, Amber and Mitty's team completed the chip implantation procedures on the prisoners, making them docile and obedient. The captain of the operation, Bianca, came over for an update. Looks like you're done with the preparations. Will there be any issues later? No. We've tested the chip and the potion with multiple experiments, Amber said. There won't be any problems, but if their opponents are too strong, there is a risk that they'll be overpowered. The modified prisoners had their strength increased, but they were far from invincible. Rather than being sent to Cadus to engage in a self-destructive battle, it was more accurate to say that this was a test of their combat prowess. Bianca wasn't too concerned. She had experience on the battlefield. Even if she were alone in Cadus, she would be able to stir up a storm by herself. I'll take them to the port, and we'll board the ship to Cadus. The prisoners had retained their awareness and understood the danger of the mission, but compared to a life in the dark and dreary prison, fighting recklessly with their lives on the line was a much better option. There were some who tried to escape, but they became submissive when a weak electric current released by the chip stimulated their nerves and enhanced their pain. If they disobeyed orders, they would suffer an ending worse than death. Bianca gave them a rundown of the plan. When you arrive at the port, we'll rest at the hotel for 1 day. Enjoy the commodities to your heart's content. The day after, we'll be going to the suburbs to ruin the construction projects the U.S. is investing in. The prisoners were ecstatic. If we succeed, we won't need to return to the prison, right? We can carry out other missions. We'll be loyal to Warhawk. Theoretically speaking, they wouldn't be leaving Cadus alive. The orders sent to their chips would instruct them to push their bodies to the limits and fight until they were destroyed. But Bianca hadn't told them the details. To boost the morale, she agreed. Of course, your skills are valuable. As long as you complete the mission, a life of luxury and indulgence will be waiting for you. She gave them IDs and passports with fake identities before they boarded. When the ship set sail, its trajectory was captured by the United States' reconnaissance satellite. At this time, Stephen and Trey met up with the Leviathan Unit's intelligence team at the Customs Administration building. The chief of the Customs Department greeted them. Welcome to Cadus, Mr. Adams. I've received instructions from the higher-ups. I'll be assisting you with the inspection. Just follow the usual procedures. Prepare uniforms for my team and have them stay at the entrance. The exterior of the AI chip was covered with a layer of special cells that blocked detection from scanning equipment. To distinguish the modified prisoners from regular tourists, they would have to resort to ancient methods used before the era of technology, observing their body language and facial expressions. All martial artists emitted an aura, and it became stronger the more they cultivated. This was the biggest difference between them and a regular person. Having the ability to mask aura completely spoke volumes about a martial artist's profound cultivation. For typical martial artists, auras made them fireflies in the darkness. But genetically modified martial artists had no aura when they weren't in combat. It was a challenging task to detect them. How do we minimize the impact? The chief asked. Tourism was vital to Cadus's economy. They couldn't leave a bad impression on the tourists because of the battle with a couple of strange martial artists. Are there any large underground sealed spaces to lure them to? The chief shook his head. It's humid in these parts, and we can't prevent the seawater from pouring in during high tides or heavy rains. Okay, when the ship docks, I'll send someone to board to take care of them directly, Stephen said. If the Sovereign and his people fought in the cabins, it wouldn't be easy to prevent their enemies from jumping into the water and escaping. This was an unreliable method, and if it failed, the chief would be dismissed from his post. He reluctantly decided to sacrifice a 5-star hotel. How about this, Mr. Adams? When they check into the hotel, I'll block the doors, windows, entrances, and exits. Your people can let loose inside. It doesn't matter how much damage they cause. Stephen's eyes lit up. This was an even better idea. After finalizing the plan, they braced themselves for a long wait. The Leviathan Unit's intelligence personnel installed a facial recognition camera at the port. Time passed slowly. After 2 days of waiting, Warhawk's ship finally approached the docks at night. Stephen and the chief went to the monitoring room at the Customs Administration building to oversee the situation. A drawn-out whistle echoed across the docks as the ships reached the shore. Bianca was dressed in designer clothes and wearing an assortment of accessories. She looked like a typical rich young lady. The prisoners kept a low profile and followed her, maintaining a certain distance. After being locked up in prison for so long and not utilizing their inner energy, it was hard for them to conceal their auras. That made it easy for Steven's team to distinguish them from the tourists. Bianca and her team took 4 cabs to the hotel. It was located halfway up the mountain, quiet, with a beautiful view. The first thing her team did when they entered their rooms was order everything on the menu. Abalone, lobster, sea cucumber, sea urchin, and lots of wine. Cadis's officials contacted the owner and quietly took over the hotel. Half an hour later, Steven and his team entered the hotel dressed like tourists. The owner went to their room to greet them. "What are they up to?" Steven asked. "Are they drunk?" "Not yet," the owner said. "They're eating and drinking like their lives depend on it." "Send more wine to their rooms. When the fight breaks out, damages are unavoidable. I hope you don't mind." Not at all. The owner was aware of the royal family's astronomical compensation to the U.S. It was nothing compared to one hotel. The Leviathan unit members on the roof crushed energy crystals of different attributes into powder and scattered them over the ground to set up an array. As midnight approached, the conversations coming from the prisoners' rooms became louder and more unintelligible. Seeing that the timing was right, Steven and his team split up and got to work. Steven crushed the door handle to Bianca's room. He threw open the door and saw her dancing to elegant classical music. Noticing the intruder, she pulled off her facial mask and turned towards him. "Who are you?" "Your enemy." Bianca was composed, and her reaction speed was fast. She threw her cosmetic bottles at Steven just as the words left his mouth. Some of the bottles were filled with poison that she'd carefully concocted. Steven's reaction was also fast. He crossed the room in a split second, leaving after images behind. He shattered a vase and tossed the shards at Bianca, returning the favor. The porcelain shards were sharper than blades. The space was limited, and Bianca was forced to flip through the air to hide behind a leather sofa. She heard the sounds of battle coming from the rooms next door. "You infiltrated the entire hotel? You must have put a lot of work into the effort to ambush us." "Thank you for the compliment, but our hard work is of no concern of yours. If you want to live, then surrender." Dream on. While Bianca was dodging the shards, she grabbed a dagger from the table. She jumped out behind the sofa and sent waves of inner energy at Steven. It tore through the room, slicing the wallpaper and furniture to pieces.